Hi everybody, and welcome to the last of our 3 recordings about the Cold War period. Once again, I want to point out that what we're doing here is we're talking about this particular topic basically from beginning to end, which means that we're covering a span of about 45 years. So that's going to overlap the things that we'll talk about in other sections, and so if you get confused about the chronology or the timelines involved here at all, please make sure to let me know, because I don't want people to think that this all happened at a time and then there's other things that happened after that or in front of that, because what we're looking at in this particular case is a longer term kind of situation, right? So in the previous recordings, we talked about what the Cold War was, how it came about, and some of the incidents during the Cold War, things like Korea or the Cuban Missile Crisis. Also talked a little bit about what kinds of an impact the Cold War has domestically. So things like McCarthyism and the HUAC hearings, where the United States itself is trying to confront the issue of paranoia and fear about the possibility of a communist insurgency, a communist insurrection, sort of working to undermine the American democratic capitalist system. So that's where we were for the previous recordings. In this recording, what we're going to look at is a brief period of kind of sort of cooling, reduced tensions during the Cold War, during the 1970s especially, but then what ramps up during the Reagan administration, leading ultimately to the collapse of communism from a sort of standpoint of governments that are controlled by communist dictatorships, at least. And that begins at the very end of the 1980s and into the early 1990s. So if you've got questions about any of this stuff, please make sure to let me know. Make sure that you're looking at the full PowerPoints as well so that you get all of the content. And here we go. So the Cuban Missile Crisis in some ways sort of scares both the United States and the Soviet Union into looking for ways to ease some of those tensions, right? To kind of settle things down. That doesn't mean that the countries don't keep producing nuclear weapons. It doesn't mean that the countries back away from the positions that they're already at. It just means that they try to find ways to reduce the likelihood or the imminent threat of a nuclear war. And this is a period that's known as détente. Basically, détente means the two sides exist in this sort of status quo, right? They'll maintain a certain level of readiness, they will maintain a certain preparedness, they will be vigilant and active in sort of keeping an eye on the other side, but they won't push the envelope further in the direction of either advanced rhetoric or any kind of provocative kind of actions or developments that might tip the balance in the direction of conflict. So partially, as I said, this is in response to the very real threat that the Cuban Missile Crisis presented in 1962. So there are improved communications between the capitals of the Soviet Union and the United States. There are treaties designed to limit the manufacture and the sort of extent of nuclear weapons. These are known as the SALT treaties, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And there are some treaties and agreements and negotiations that are, in theory, designed to reduce some of the ideological or sort of rhetorical kinds of tensions, right? For instance, the Helsinki Accords, the United States and the Soviet Union enter into this agreement that says, well, the Soviet Union will agree to allow free elections to happen in Eastern Europe, which was for decades really an area of Soviet kind of satellite control. That doesn't necessarily pan out in the way that the Accords claim that they're going to, but at the very least, the conversation is getting a little bit calmer. That period of détente, though, is going to come to kind of a crashing halt with a couple of events that happen at the very late 1970s and into the 1980s. And those are the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979, and President Reagan is elected in 1980. And so those are both going to fit directly into a very dramatic escalation of the Cold War, both rhetorically in the kind of conversation and description of what's happening in the Cold War, but then also in terms of the kind of approach that the United States in particular undertakes in dealing with the Soviet Union. So by 1980, the Soviet Union has expanded its involvement in sort of influencing communist and Marxist regimes in a number of different places around the world. So some of that is in Africa, so countries like Angola or Ethiopia, Central America in the country of Nicaragua, Asia in Afghanistan. So Ronald Reagan is a die-hard Cold Warrior, and Reagan personally believes that the Soviet Union is, as he calls it, the evil empire, right? That it is threatening global domination, that it is a monolithic, evil entity that is that must be confronted in order to prevent the ultimate collapse of the world into the hands of godless communism. And so he is sort of revitalizing older sort of ideas and rhetoric and beliefs that were fairly common among conservatives in the United States for a long time, but had kind of gone a little bit dormant in the 1970s, and he sort of revitalizes that. And partially what he's doing then is rhetorical, right? He's saying things that are kind of inflammatory and provocative about Soviet Union being evil and the United States needing to fight against evil everywhere it is. But he's also doing physical things to kind of ramp up the Cold War. So he is deploying new missile systems throughout Europe that are going to add to tensions, escalating the nuclear arms race once again, even though the SALT treaties had limited the development and production of certain nuclear weapons. These missiles fall outside of the boundaries of those treaties, and so the Soviets then begin to develop those technologies too. Reagan announces a program that's known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. It's nicknamed Star Wars. It never goes into effect. Whether it was even practical is a matter of a lot of debate, and was even at the time. Basically, this was going to be an umbrella of satellites that would be orbiting around the Earth that would intercept and destroy Soviet ballistic missiles. So if the Soviet Union launched a missile from Russia, and it would fly into the atmosphere and then come down on the United States, this Star Wars system was going to use laser beams and missiles and different things to intercept those Soviet missiles that were going to, in theory, reach American cities. It was never put into effect, but the fact that it was proposed, the fact that it was making its way through Congress in a variety of different, funding bills and investigations and stuff, contributes to this increased tension, because the Soviets see that kind of thing and they perceive that as an escalation of tension between the two countries as well. Gradually, though, things start to cool, fortunately. Definitely Reagan is an advocate of what comes to be known as the Reagan Doctrine, which is much more aggressive, much more confrontational than traditional containment, right? Traditional containment says, we'll let the Soviets be where they are, we'll just stop them from advancing into new places. the Reagan Doctrine said, if there are Soviet-influenced governments anywhere in the world, the United States needs to overturn those governments if the United States is going to ultimately win the Cold War. So it's one thing to prevent the emergence of a Soviet-backed or Soviet-influenced government someplace in the world. But it's another thing, the way Reagan is saying it, to go into an area. Cuba would be a good example, right? Cuba was a Soviet-influenced, to some extent Soviet-backed government. This doctrine would advocate going into Cuba or using some methods, whether it's outright invasion and military force or not, using some methods to eliminate that Soviet-backed government in Cuba and replace it with one that is friendly with the United States, or at the very least would be deemed acceptable by the United States. And so they do this in a couple of places, right? They help to implement or install what appear to be democratic governments in the Philippines and South Korea. The Philippines is a tricky case because it ends up being a fairly totalitarian system for a while. But it supports the American perspective of resisting Soviet expansion, and so the United States is nothing if not fuzzy in sort of approaching the ideologies of quote-unquote friendly nations, as long as they support the anti-communist bent that the Americans sort of pursue. One of the other things that contributes to this cooling off of tensions is Mikhail Gorbachev, the incoming Soviet premier, undertakes a couple of different policy changes internally in Russia that are designed to improve the Soviet economy, but also to kind of bring the Soviet Union more into the global community. So you have two different policies. One's known as glasnost and one is perestroika, and they do similar kinds of things in different areas of Soviet life. So perestroika is a restructuring of the Soviet economy so that it's less sort of dogmatically communist and Marxist. And then glasnost is sort of an openness in terms of popular culture, media outlets that can be accessed in Russia, and these sorts of things, right? And so this does really contribute to a thawing of the Cold War. Fortunately, Reagan decides to engage with Gorbachev in these areas, right? So rather than staying completely fanatically anti-communist, Reagan does decide to take these overtures and take these changes inside the Soviet Union as evidence of the possibility that there is a way to sort of lead to the end of the Cold War without necessarily just the increased escalation of military force and sort of inflammatory rhetoric, right? So the first official sort of disarmament treaty, right, not just limiting what weapons will be built, but actually removing weapons from the arsenal, is what's called the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. This is an agreement that is reached between Reagan and Gorbachev in the 1980s to help continue that process of sort of lessening those tensions and scaling things down a little bit. And so you have then ultimately the conditions that are ripe for the fall of communism. Reagan leaves office in 1989, and the next president, George H.W. Bush, so he's the father of the most recent George Bush from the early 2000s. George H.W. Bush continues the sort of momentum that had been building during the latter years of Reagan's presidency to help encourage a pro-democratic transition in Eastern European states. So these states begin to, in one way or another, whether this is purely through political means, whether this is through a more violent kind of revolution, whether this is through, in some cases, the expansion of a politically democratic labor movement. Whatever the case may be, countries like Poland and Hungary and Romania begin to sort of throw off the influence and control, in some respects, of the Soviet Union. Probably the most dramatic of these is the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? So in 1989, Germans living in Berlin begin to basically occupy the Berlin Wall, begin to tear it into pieces, break it open, right? This is a wall that had been built in the early 1960s that had separated the city of Berlin for decades, almost 3 decades. And this is a very, very symbolic part of the overall collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Certainly, it's directly affecting the people that live in Berlin and the people that live in East Germany, but it is sort of a watershed moment in a lot of respects for the fall of communism more broadly considered, right? The collapse then of the communist regime in the Soviet Union is going to happen a couple years later. That happens in 1991, and it's largely the result of a combination of pro-democratic movements and also sort of a failed military coup that was hoping to oust Mikhail Gorbachev from power, right? Military officials believed that he was weakening the Soviet Union, so they placed him under house arrest and they tried to implement a military coup. The coup is not successful, and this really kind of opens the doors then for a democratic regime to emerge under the control of a man named Boris Yeltsin. Ultimately then, the Soviet Union gets dissolved, it gets broken up, and there's this kind of period of uncertainty of what the former Soviet Union will be, because it had contained a number of different countries, basically, all part of its own sphere of influence, and so it starts to splinter off into the Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan and places like that that had been part of the Soviet Union. But once the Soviet government falls, they begin to declare and gain their independence as part of that process too. So the Cold War then ends about 45 years after it begins. Certainly profound impacts on the global economy, on the balance of power globally from one nation to another, from one region to another. Certainly, the ideas of the Cold War are still present in the way that Americans deal with ideologies that are not capitalism or democracy / representative democracy, right? Those kinds of rhetorical uses of ideas of socialism or communism are still very much active in the political discourse today. So it's not something that, well, we can talk about it and it happened and it's over and that's that. There are definitely tentacles that have stretched out from the Cold War that are still relevant in American life today, and certainly that still have ripple effects in what's happening in the world all the way down to the present too. So that is the end of the Cold War material. Let me know if you've got questions. I'll be happy to help out with those. The next thing that we will get into, again, is going to kind of go back in time a little bit, right? Because next we're going to talk about civil rights, which is, we're going to focus primarily on the 1950s and 60s. Obviously, questions of equality and rights are still at the forefront of the national conversation. So, clearly this upcoming topic is not meant to suggest that everything that needed to happen regarding equal rights did happen in the 1950s and 60s, and there's nowhere else to go. It's just the surge of the civil rights movement was really centered in that time period, and so that's where we're gonna look next. So I hope you're all doing really, really well. Let me know if there's questions that I can help with, and I will see everybody soon.